Hello everyone, today we talk about the French feudal military potential and action in the 13th century. We already made, as you know, lots of videos about French feudal armies in general, not so much as it should have been proper for a medieval warfare channel. That, however, you can appreciate, I think, specifically about the 13th century, because this is what we're going to dissect today in the relative playlist about 13th century history. Alright, so you can look also at different countries in parallel. We will look specifically at this list of forces required, requested, but also the ones that would be actually employed, right, as the difference between what, say, the feudal levy should have been theoretically in the actual armies that were levied, and in regarding these specific element that in fact in 13th century France should have been properly the backbone of the entire system, and it really was, right? France was at this point the most powerful polity in Europe, right? Being this, again, always enormous Atlantic dominion, right, with an immense amount of people and agricultural resources, now imperially dominated by a monarchic dynasty that had elevated itself through the same feudal system over the other various, by the way, feudal competitors, and that was thus deeply soaked in such not just imperial mystique, almost a Catholic universal one, as a matter of fact, as the leaders of Europe, given that they were also overflowing, spilling in other countries with this manpower and more. But that, however, was literally booming as far as the feudal hierarchy was being actually built. Right, there is no doubt that in the 13th century, also thanks to France, feudalism was at its peak. Right, cavalry was as well, morally and technologically. This is really the moment of greatest dominance of the mounted arm over the foot troops, right? And there is so much to tell. Again, that's why we made so few about this topic in the first place. But it boomed so much that, of course, the greatest problem of the kingdom, especially in the following century, but starting from this one, was such rapidity in expansion. And what initially was successful enough, in fact, to gather such an enormous amount of forces, but still not completely in a, say modern, what we would think, many people do have this problem, or not picturing the fact that there was no such thing like a state, at least in the way we intend modernly or contemporarily, even more precisely. And that, of course, this enormous power had just been in becoming in this century, and especially towards the end of it, when the entire system, say worldwide, Eurasia, entered in crisis, right, because of the essentially the overexpansion of the great medieval civilization, even the exhaustion of many moral and material resources. This Leviathanic kingdom of France had to essentially keep things together quite tightly, and it entered a crisis that, say, began like it would do for any other power, of course, at this point, but it gradually increased up to the mid-14th century, where the crack really arrived, and that France was to suffer, especially through the 100 Years' War, and so all at least the most spectacular military failures of the French royal army against the English at that point, which doesn't quite fit, however, the say simple national dichotomy, right, sense of confrontation, because basically England worked more or less in the same way. Actually, France was more advanced strategically and culturally, right, and also militarily, we can say, right. This is not to say that England did not perform incredibly well, but this was owed much to her leaders, the the strategic and tactical contingencies that, as we know, can vary. This is not to say that the English victories were not part of an evident string of systemic quality, etc. But the war in the end was won by France for a reason. And in general, the French maintained throughout essentially most European history the upper hand as the most qualitative army out there, in as much as being essentially the largest one, and so the most powerful one at the same time. And the differences between Europeans, even in that regard, being negligible in the measure in which we're talking again about pre-industrial societies, so everything was dramatically similar, and especially so in the Middle Ages, for which the causes of such, say, crisis, of course, must be scoped for the previous century, the 13th, understanding how that system that fundamentally remained just later on within the Ancien regime had been established, right, with this massive need of stabilization, but that eventually succeeded in the same clamorous way. And that I have also partly explained in that video about the 14th century French army organization that is dedicated exactly to that, meaning, yes, the French, again, were defeated in battles like Crécy, Poitiers. We have analyzed specifically, we have seen there that actually the French were quite competent, like in most of these cases. Again, pop culture makes of these outcomes mostly a matter deep, essentially moral, cultural inferiority, but that's actually not the case especially when you look at that very comparison and how the odds really were for that matter. And as we have observed, this problem, however, materialized in such brutal outcomes, is to be observed from, of course, how the way these armies were put together, what was ideally required, right, on which basis, and essentially on which premises as well, right, meaning who is that has to owe allegiance to whom, and say how and who does put together these resources, what are the capacities banally to provide these knights with an adequate collective training, a certain level of homogenization and standardization, how much the way Capetian France had been put together politically was affecting that, right? So this, in turn, is also an immense topic that is really just the reason why I make these videos, but of course many others should be made further to provide with an adequate answer to, right? So today we look again at the theory and the practice of at least in as much as the feudal manpower, right, required was actually met, right, on the field, on the campaign. I skip any other premise regarding, of course, the nature, again, of French chivalry, the fact that these guys, again, were essentially the country, northern France, northeastern France, from which not just feudalism, but the very root of the Carolingian, the Merovingian Empire had spread. Many people say, but that's not the same thing. It doesn't matter. It's still the same system that is also developing dramatically. We've seen it in the video, for example, about the videos about Lotharingian warfare, how much continuity there was with the Carolingian military system throughout the following centuries, because again, to segment too much the Middle Ages when things were basically, let's say, always the same in the essential, right, especially compared to the breathtaking rhythms of our own system, right, is just self-evident in many ways, even in the same panoply of the Milas, right, the entire picture didn't really change too much, right, but it's exactly this increased capacity, right, to manage larger amounts of troops and knowing how to lead them, how to field them, for which operations, and with which motivations, by the way, is really key, right? also consider that the 13th century is the peak of feudalism pretty much all over Europe, right? And or at least to this sort of pre-Protestantal system affirming itself on the traditional structure, however implemented with an increased degree of power concentration. Again, France is very similar to England. These are very symbiotic countries in many ways, not just because of the Norman conquest, the French language in among the elite, etc., but because they're really that close, and they really do stem from a background that had been very much in common from ever. Like if you look at the time of the Celts, the one of the Romans, throughout, in fact, most of the Norman bridge there that surely brought these countries a bit together before a relatively different history, but not that much as we could think. Really, Britain does, and England particularly, does fit Western Europe in this political institutional sense, even though it's a Northern European country. But these are also, categories that are debatable, depending on what you're really looking at. And the result of this was the systematic compaction, also through relentless military activity, of an army based primarily not just on the mounted elite, right? So the militarists, heavily armored, mounted military professionals, but as we were saying, the gluing factor politically, morally, culturally of the dominion of a feudal hierarchy held by at the top by the same this essentially imperial dynasty as the French one had profiled itself historically, that had to spread the faith in the Catholic order through such feudal bonds that recognized its overlordship. Right. This is true pretty much like in the most compact Western kingdom. We're talking England, France, Castile, Sicily. This, especially in a strictly feudal sense, right? These are countries that really look similar to one another. On paper, they all have thousands, actually, of vassal knights that can't be called up to arms. The only, of course, a discriminant here being the fact that, as we were saying before, there is no such thing like a contemporary centralized state, which means that the modes of recruitment, of summoning, of calling up these troops varied case by case, fief from fief, vassal from vassal, right? And so everything had to be negotiated in a way that actually was practically simpler than the merely administrative side of the story, because these people were devoted to the cause after all, and or had specific interests, sometimes also to disobey, but in that sense to still serve for somebody else, because of course a vassal that disobeys to the captains is surely a guy that is winking at the Angevins, right? And or at least at the English monarchy after they had lost most possessions at the beginning of the century in France. And I made multiple videos about the spread of military companies, specifically for the 13th century, the cost of war, military wages, and we have already observed yesterday, we were talking just about medieval mercenaries and the relative, nonsense of distinguishing specifically a vassal, right, in the way he would concretely perform military service from a mercenary, because feudalism had always been based on this wishful thinking that, I prepay everything in terms of your military performance by giving you literally all the means that will render you able to arm yourself and to provide the same service, except I cannot control them because I give them in a decentralized position. I'm not there this entire concept of fealty and the various oaths and the bond is held on not merely, again, that wishful thinking, but the fact that these clienteles were quite variable, especially before, again, a more concentrated power could be established. And of course, in many ways, especially in the 13th century, where medieval economy starts becoming very monetary in nature, right? And so professionalism, it becomes really is at its peak, and we can't say that it saturates the same market of war, because from this moment onwards, basically you see the traditional levies declining, right? Traditional levies, militias, at least militia meant, say, the English way, because the militas were technically the militia, right? So the militia meant as the professional soldiery. But speaking of anybody else, right, the other estates were going down in terms of even the practical provision of an adequate military power, because again, knighthood was at her peak and facing the charge of, again, heavy cavalry on the battlefields of this era, especially in the French countryside, was not exactly, a very sensible purpose if you were an infantryman and you were looking forward to a moderately long life for the time standards. And of course, this is not to say, actually, I made some videos. We'll talk about French infantry because it's very underrated, right? And it's misrepresented enough because it was a thing, but again, in this country, the elite is so ultra elite that, of course, most of what we get, even in terms of documents, etc., reflects mostly that perspective. But of course, at this point, really, you don't have in this country anybody who could face successfully heavy cavalry in open field, if not other heavy cavalry, right? And everything was dramatically homogeneous, as we explained. In Western Europe, Central Europe, everybody fought essentially in the same way, right? You can find different, say, degrees of social segmentation, for which we can have more or less infantry in the ratio, etc. But overall, Western European armies look pretty much similar to one another. Maybe in the Celtic fringe they don't, maybe somewhere there is still some ethnic bias of some sort, but overall the backbone is this one. And also because it had been France that had, in this meta-national sense, again, from Frankish times, overflowed everywhere. This is the time which, again, there are still the Outremer states, the Latin empires being created de facto by the French knights. You have, at this point, the French conquering the Kingdom of Sicily, invading Catalonia, Flanders, really kicking out, essentially, the Angevins almost completely out of the country. They expand into some areas that were part of the Holy Roman Empire. We've seen it in the video about the Dauphiné and the Kingdom of Burgundy. So there's really a lot of stuff going on, right? That is the overpouring also of these various knights for how they were now being promised in general in exchange for their service more. But even though consider that most of them still, and this is how traditional really the 13th century was, we're doing it, and we will see it also as far as the connection fact that with the king was concerned, largely as, again, free contractors, as freemen, as noblemen who went out there in the world in the adventure and just leaving that life journey on horseback, swords in hand, massacring people in order to bring order, reason, discipline in the world. And France is similar also to England, this trend. For example, if you look at a source that is the Scripta de Fedis and the documents that also you can connect to it, the great Philip II Augustus, King of France, after his brilliant conquests, right, achieved through a very by the way, innovative, updated sense of war, right? The introduction of mercenaries, right? Sending the various nobility, say the untrustworthy aristocracy to spill blood in the Cathar Occitania, and while instead fighting with professionals, with mercenaries against the Anglo-Germans in the north, could dispose of the military service of different thousands of knights, in theory, for free. Because deep down the system, the concept that existed since Clovis times, that is to say, in theory, this realm and whoever lived on it was technically could be disposed by the king, right? In that sense, in a truly subtle fashion, in a sense of an idea of public demand, like it existed in Roman times, but in a sense of public authority, even in the Germanic one, even though with a different idea of what public properly means, and that gets down to the idea of truly, if the strongest of the strongest is able to tame all the others, he really can claim that, right, by divine right. This was the universal, the only belief that existed in the world anywhere at the time. Well, then these various thousands of knights, considering the enormity of the Western Frankish kingdom, now with Philip called finally properly Royaume de France in vernacular, right, in the official documents, is owed just by divine will, right? These guys as being, again, prepaid by the king, that the interior possesses everything, every part of the country, but that allows these various vassals to be in control of part of it, and as such, provided with all the means to make war, can call these people for free, that must simply, again, that are just in theory profiting from and or more or less balancing out this request with what they've been provided with feudally. It's really for free, right? Without any other exchange, without any other pay, etc. As we've seen, this was practically not true, right? Pay was still there, etc. But the idea that you could be called up to arms because you were just a subject of the monarchy, and especially as a vassal provided with a fief that was institutionally recognized, because there was no other way but having it by a king, really meant that you were to respond that call, that appeal. There is a list dating back to the 10s and 20s of the 13th century indicating that the French vexin had to provide 30 knights, Ponthieu 60, the Castellanese of Saint-Quentin, Montdidier, and Roy, respectively 40, 50, and 50. Right. Now, you say, well, it's a few. These are, first of all, are relatively small districts, right? But if you look at the entirety of the Capetian dominion, you have really the impression of this, to say the least, considerable availability of human resources. But here we're not talking about the millions of people that inhabited the entirety of the kingdom. Here we're talking about single knights, right? So that elite military professionals that, again, at this point are becoming very much standardized. The 13th century is a period in which the same squires basically get equipped like their master. So the increasing, again, professionalization, monetization makes them ever more homogeneous, and that's also why the European Milas more or less has the same face. But even, say, let's look at the smallest one, the Vexin. 30 knights cost an enormity just by itself. Again, I have to make this damn video about the actual cost of a medieval knight, right? The sheer amount of just if you get the measure of how much a war horse consumes in terms of fodder, and how much logistically can strain, like, and in protracted over time, like even just for the knight to be constantly maintained, fit in arms. The panoply, people say, oh my god, weapons cost that much. Yes, it is true. Having a warhorse, a military panoply was just like having a Bugatti today. But compared to the rest of society, that worked entirely for you to have that, right? But here we're talking about not just, again, the object, but the fact that you had to essentially live exclusively on horseback as a knight, right? Not just because the king would call you, but because you had to administer the entire seigneury. You had to bring order, you had certain prerogatives, privileges, but in this sense, duties, right, towards the community. And as such, you had always to provide with that traumatically violent military deterrence that was effectively the one really boosting forward dramatically the superiority of Western civilization to this very day. The undisputed and undisputable and absolute superiority of Western civilization. This is not a thing that you can't debate. Here, literally, again, the 13th century breaks any dam that existed before. The West has boomed and will remain in charge this very day. And basically nobody facing this system manages to win at the end of the day, right? Doesn't matter how you have setbacks. Here we're looking in a civilizational, cultural, and spiritual sense about the superiority of a system that outlived any other in that capacity. And France is the beating heart of this very thing, spurting blood everywhere, and in this inseminating the entire world with power, authority, discipline, strength, brutal discipline, and so all the things that really are the sap, right, of the superiority of Western civilization. And these men, like 30, 60, 40, 50, these forces created such a traumatic shock capacity on the battlefield to the French armies that this, again, could not really quite be met in any other way but essentially emulating the same model. But not much, because, again, the rest of Europe had to learn how to make a knight fight. But because, again, France was enormous now and was beating everybody at collective discipline, at just the big guns, right? The supplies, the force, the armament, the technique, right? There were interesting competitors, right? But the comprehensive unitarity of this system is really what brings to hegemonize through, especially the alliance with the papacy. So this massive French Provençal Guelph papal Angevin Neapolitan empire that fundamentally stretches from the Channel to Anatolia, to the Near East, really is the living proof of this. And this, we're not talking just about, think about French culture and how much it was spreading dramatically in pretty much everywhere in Western Europe, etc., and bringing together with these highest meanings of chivalry that, of course, were essentially the medieval re-edition of the doctrine of struggle and victory, right, of the traditional universal spirituality and psychophysical machia, right? So these forces alone, right, provided even by these relatively small districts, give you an idea, first of all, how rich these places were. Again, the French soil is very fat, right? The reason why you can't see these massive cathedrals in the Ile-de-France, the same rise of the Carpathians, this is because the land is fat, right, and rich. People work. There are lots of people, right? These are not, qualitatively speaking, the richest places in the world. There is a massive divide between the aristocracy and the peasantry, but in absolute terms, quantitatively, this is the largest country in Europe, right? Demographically, economically, this is the deal, right? And this will not stop, because when you look at, say, Louis XIV or Napoleon, you're looking at the same system that is incredibly messy to keep together, but once it does, right, it becomes essentially an hegemonic threat for the entire Europe. I will not digress also on the critical figures here, rulers like, in fact, Philip II, Louis IX, Philip IV. All right, there are some of the greatest rulers in the history of Europe, to say it, and beyond, actually. So the people working behind this, that's the immense deal, right? Remember how the seigneurial system had affirmed itself, the practical, objective, rational necessity of this order. The greatest territorial princes of France responded to the royal calls with substantially numerous contingents. In 1236, for example, 19 dukes and counts were summoned 3 weeks before the Lent in Saint-Germain-en-Laye for the service. The list containing their names also refers to the episcopal service. Never forget about this. It doesn't forget the Reine d'Orléans, the Queen of Orleans, that is to say, the widow of Philip Augustus, that was Ingeborg of Denmark, that essentially kept the Orleanais as a counter dowry by title, basically, nor, quote, all of those that are at her dependence and of their service at their own expense, who have lands of the value of 60 pounds or more, right? So this is fascinating, because bishops were, just like in other Western European countries, always eligible to military service. At least they had a specific duty as vassals to provide with the episcopal contingents in support of the monarchy, and the Capetians had risen to dramatic power thanks to, in fact, the episcopal support, as it happened, generally speaking, in every country. Like in the 13th century, yes, eventually, like in places like Germany, etc., you have bishops starting to feudalize themselves further in some circumstances, not really supporting the monarchy that much anymore. In fact, in France, with this enormous monarchic power, actually it's the same kings that tend to, wear out a bit what the also equally impressive episcopal power, for example, boosting the rights of the communes, right, especially in the northeast of France, where again the most powerful prelates of the kingdom really were, had supported the Capetians from that from that region, but and in fact this causes essentially a bit of a demilitarization of the same bishops themselves. So you know that from Carolingian times, bishops had the duty specifically to accompany their contingents up to the front line. So you had literally in Charlemagne's time some bishops crossing Europe, right, in hundreds, thousands of kilometers on the roads of the time. By the way, with that massive, as shocking level of logistical organization that the system had, right, with various warehouses scattered, again, always the fodder for the horses, so were mounted contingents. Remember that on the basis, that's what made most of the supplies needs. Then you have these guys living essentially within, again, a fief that, however, was ruled by different, again, figures. In this case, she was the widow of the king, just within, because as you know, the Capetians were distributed an enormous amount of lands from the ones, especially from the enormous sum of Angevin fiefs in France, and many noblemen in the Western Frankish kingdom had already been peers of France, but this is reinforced when literal brothers of the same kings, for example, started these various branches that we start knowing also by that name. It were always Capetians. It would be so, for example, the Valois, the later the Bourbon, etc. That they're named after the various fiefs, but they're still part of the same enormous clan, right? That now has highly dynastic and again imperial and somehow, in fact, mystically exalted, etc., was ruling alone, right, as a single family. This had been the deal since Clovis, conceptually, right, as a single blood of chosen kings by God, the largest dominion in Christendom. And so there is a sense of elevation, of redemption, right, of being the vassal of this or that guy, right? Everything was felt also in interpersonal relations as a very, mutual exchange, like all clienteles, clienterly ties were really about, right? So your devotion, your good fortune, your sense of accomplishment had a lot to do with the way you would fight, but in connection with the thief and who was giving it to you, and so giving you this chance, right, historically, even though, of course, many noblemen were deeply rooted in these provinces, and just, of course, thought of themselves a bit like those local lords, the local monarchs, right, on the rest of the population. And that's what defined nobility in many ways. Today we don't talk about the lock of nobility that had actually began from the end of the 12th century, the third, fourth, fundamentally, and that was essentially widening the gap between, in fact, this elite and the rest of the population, and also the lesser aristocracy. That actually made the bulk and would remain doing so until essentially the French Revolution of the French forces, but that this regard was also ever less connected with the top to some degree, and there are some problems politically and morally with that, at least if we project them in terms of the cadres of the hierarchy, of the command chain, etc. And some of these possessions, by the way, were immense. This is yet another problem, that fiefs, again, had been confiscated from other rulers, etc. Sometimes a single guy ruled an enormous amount of land that he wouldn't naturally administer, just like the various families that were habituated to rule from, right? Especially if they had been taken out, right? Because they had sided against the Capetians at some point. So of course there would be somebody else in their stead. But the higher nobility becomes ever more detached in a sense, and the lesser one also is some sort of new one in some instances, right? And so the system must glue itself back together, and to coalesce further to make up for this gap, let's say. In any case, we know, going back to military service, that this was demanded through bailiffs in the bailiwicks of Vermandois, Orléans, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and in the rest of Normandy. Now, we have also the data from a census that is very close in time of all the knights vassals of the king or of others of the Castellany of Milan, that in fact owned the aforementioned 60 pounds of land income that, as we've seen, was essentially the criterion, the basic, right, in fact, wealth that would oblige you to provide this service at your own expenses. And importantly enough, the number of such knights totals 75. Though it's not to say that these districts were particularly like £60 of income or just that small. It could field that much, and this is an immense force. Again, when we look at a similar inquiry concerning the castellany of Corbeil, we have 40. Right, this could vary even on the same basis of the income for whichever reason, because again, the amount of troops provided was, in a sense, negotiated. First of all, aside from even just from a quantitative point of view, not just the various conditions, but of course it could also be a more or less qualitative contingent. So this was evaluated at some point, aside from the formal demand that could also be just imagine all the emergential situations, war, political intrigue. It was already a big deal that these guys could provide you with 40 knights, right? So applying a proportional criterion to the other French regions interested by the royal summoning, we can have an idea of the remarkable forces of which in that date Louis IX could dispose within the traditional limits of 40 essentially days without pay. This is the basic time span that had been affirming itself in France and in part also elsewhere comparatively, for which the feudal contingent could serve. Right, the idea is that every season, meaning the season, right, in the good one, you would have from these guys that owe you free service not more than 40 days of the same requested. As we've seen also in other videos, the limit could be exceeded for whichever reason, because maybe you needed royal support, you would stay on the field longer, but that was also again a massive expense, by the way. And or you would maybe fight for other 40 days for your own business somewhere else under some other lord, right? Let's assume, I don't know, I'm a vassal of the Duke of Normandy who is required by the king to send me at war for these 40 days for free. Then I will fight for him. As we will see, there are also some geographical limits, but temporarily that's 40 days. But when I came back to Normandy, after this, maybe the Duke of Normandy, after maybe I am under him normally actually during the expedition, but we'll have to fight against another rebel lord, right, of Normandy and or in England, and so I will go there, right? And of course, all this was like quite calibrated. Again, the expenses were in many ways prohibitive. There were very sound material, limitations that you couldn't quite just decline to the moral one that, of course, had fatigue, exhaustion, etc. But the concept is still that there is a limit in the actual power of the monarchy that is the one, of course, of a feudal pre-industrial world where you don't have a real state, you don't have that coercive capacity that contemporary governments have, together with the massive deterrence and military effectiveness that they have. So everything was growing in that regard. These guys would be, again, extremely violent individuals because the sole purpose, conceptually, of what a medieval knight is a guy that basically has to be able to massacre tens of thousands of people in a row, right? And without blinking an eye, because that's how he's being first destroyed as a human being and then recomposed as a pure slaughtering machine. And the entire purpose of his entire life is exclusively based in this massive amount of bloodshed. And that works, pretty damn well, because then politically he will be employed for that specific end. And there is an enormous, of course, exactly because of the aforementioned limitation, space for exercising in this form of violence. Right? Consider that up to very recently, looking at these times, tournaments were literal battles, right? People say, but no, they were kind of different. There was also the palisade, but no, that's the joust, and that's another thing. We're talking about actual high medieval tournaments where there was no war. They would actually pick a field worked by peasants, inhabited, etc. They would make a mess. They would destroy themselves, would break bones, smash teeth, and kill people, just like in any other battle. And they were all hyper excited and looking forward toward that. They were essentially always testing each other in that way, because they had to be brutally selected continuously to ensure the fact that this was an actual elite, a morally superior race of people ruling over the rest of the world, right? This is what they were brought up believing deeply, and where, of course, an individual knight was immensely superior, both morally and physically, to, say, a peasant. There is no doubt whatsoever. That's the reason why they could kill so many people in the first place. But the point being is that in order to have that, you had to exercise this capacity continuously. And there was no room for anything else, aside from, of course, other aspects, say, of courtly life, of, politics, of the same hunt that was an aristocratic sport par excellence, etc. That, however, we've seen it with courtesy or courtly literature of the other day's videos, etc. Everything, the entire value system was about this, right? Procreation of this superior stock that could keep perpetuating itself and compenetrating the world with its moral, epigenetically transfigurating superiority, right? To mold the world in a better place, to rise to God, as the Gothic cathedrals beautifully represent, as pure force, right? As pure light. That's what Louis IX was about as a saint himself. So they even were serving under a holy race. Remember that this Louis IX was a lawyer. Internationally, every king in Europe asked him to solve questions, because again, the intelligence, the capacity, etc., the authority, the expertise was thought to be greater than the others, superior to the one of the others. This was a society that looked at merit, right? Not at wishful thinking. So the collection of customs, called traditionally Établissement de Saint-Louis, drafted in Touraine-Anjou towards 1270, precises that the barons and the men of the king had to serve in his army for 40 days and 40 nights, very, very fiscal about this, and beyond this time lapse that didn't seem to be, in this case at least, accompanied by limitations of spatial character, the vassals could remain, of course, in arms if, however, and only they had wanted it. However, if the king pays them, and if the war is a defensive one for the kingdom, these vassals are obliged to continue to serve, right? Because there is a causa major force, like the country is attacked, yet not as major as the right of these guys to still say, after these 40 days, if I'm not paid, I'm not forced to serve. At that point, however, if both factors, both conditions are met, these guys are obliged to fight for the king. Naturally, this is an affirmation of further, again, monarchical authority, but it well highlights that the counterpart was ideally the fact that this was a country of freemen of some sort, that obviously in the case of noblemen were also freemen more important than others, and worthier than others, right? And recognized as such by the system, so by the monarchy. So this is all, but by everyone really. But so everything was compenetrated in this traditional universal belief. But at this point, you must also discipline them to serve, as we've seen in these circumstances. If the king, as the French ones were starting to have, as we've seen from Philip II Augustus, enough to buy mercenaries and to get rid of this, in theory, freely serving vassals in part, to pay them for further service. And of course, campaigns lasted more than that. Say, I don't know if you've ever studied a medieval campaign from the sources, but they normally lasted. They could be just brief expeditions, but say forces of hundreds of thousands of men normally were employed for months, right? And this is evidently the case when they were to besiege strongholds, and so that could take quite a while, etc. We will see these in other videos, hopefully, right? And there is yet another clause regarding the last service conditions, that is to say, if while these knights have basically stayed under the king's command for 40 days, if he wants to have them fight outside the kingdom boundaries, they are not obliged to, even if the king is gonna pay for it, right? So this is also a bit of international law kicking in, saying from the within, like we don't want to be, like if you're the monarch, you have your own issues with other monarchs, but we want at least to operate just within the boundaries of the realm that is already, again, as we've seen in the historical process, a big deal to have recognized unitarily, right? Look at how much it took, right, from almost half of a millennium from Charles the Bald to Philip II Augustus to have a reunited Western Frankish kingdom, right? Now, the imperfections of the feudal military system appear fully on the occasion of the levy proclaimed by the King Philip III in Tours for the army of Foix. We are in 1272. This was actually a scarcely important expedition directed against a rebel vassal, so it was not a big deal in the first place, but it was still, of course, conditioned scrupulously. We now impart the recruitment mechanism of the troops thanks to three lists. The first one bears the name of those who were summoned and from whom the king demanded service. The second one enumerates those who actually showed up in Tours for the king, and who, by the way, precised on that occasion the service to which they deemed themselves to be obliged to. In other words, they negotiated further how long they should have been on campaign when getting there, right? These calls were always a sort of political test for showing, first of all, who was from the king's side, because again, what did happen really if you didn't show up? Yes, you would intimidate yourself, the sovereign, who would probably take some retaliatory measures, but this was in a world again ruled by feudal lords, as a whole, and the incredible complications, the unpredictability of the entire system, etc. Like, you could easily get away with a lot of things, especially as far as you didn't take offensive action against the sovereign or his friends. And showing up was a way of saying, well, it's a big deal we are here in the first place. But now we will negotiate on what we get in exchange for this campaign, etc. And then the third list, which is dating from some weeks later, and it inspects the actual troops really that had really left for campaign, and it indicates the days of service provided. So it's very instructive to look at the difference between the contribution on which the king ideally counted, basing oneself on the feudal and administrative documents that the royal chancery possessed, by the way, and that we could read, fortunately, and that instead he concretely obtained. Let's take the case of the bailiwick of the Cotentin in Normandy. The king demanded 80 knights, or the equivalent of the same, that is, calculating for each one 40 days of free service, 3,200 days. Right. So you could actually, they would even remember what we said before. It's not even about the number of the knights. What is counted is, at this point, the amount of days served evenly by it within that time span. But in fact, this is what happened, that there were 55, not 80 knights serving. And at that point, you would think, well, they would serve, for a longer time. They wouldn't. They would serve even for a shorter time. That is, overall, 2,165 days, which is something like 39 days, and saying, okay, well, yeah, we serve that much and then we go away. We don't know whether they calculated it specifically. But this shows definitely how, let's say, different, of course, reality was from what at least was owed in general, which was sort of a standard. This was a serious difference, but not a disastrous one. Let's say the system did work after all, and say it was a big deal again that these 55 knights would serve for 39 days. Concretely, they would provide with a substantial amount, I would say more than half of what was required for practically the same amount of time. On the basis of the daily pay given to the knights, the free service of the Cotentin alone amounted to 811 livres tournois, which is really a lot, right? So if you make a general proportion, supposing that the Cotentin could represent the 50th part of the military resources of the entire Kingdom of France, you could say that the French monarchy could dispose for 40 days of around 2,750 knights, that is to say the equivalent of an overall service costing 40,550 livres tournois to the vassals, that, however, being called like to serve for free and still serving for free, largely on the basis at least of this system. It was not the only one, by the way, that the French monarchy, as we've seen, had, given that had always more money ready at hand just to simply have troops more easily, could represent, right? This is interesting because when you look at medieval armies at this point, especially the royal ones, you have, we've seen them often in the Battle of Athens, etc. Always a camp, right? A royal quarter where the actual treasury of the kingdom, or at least a substantial part of that, is stored. Why? Because that would be just the sort of bait for knights to stick around, right? As long as you had that, they knew that they could get paid, right? And this meant that mercenarism, that as we observed yesterday, would at this point essentially affirm itself as the actual basis of the European armies. So in the 14th century, you have essentially just mercenaries participating, and or say paid troops concretely, even though these feudal levies in theory were still there. At that point, you would skip through this paid service all the nuisance of simply having to force these guys to serve for free. That is to say, paying, as we've seen, a lot of money just for a custom that, yes, could benefit them if, say, of course, the realm was in danger, and so they had to serve, etc., and that was readily evident. But for the way this free service had structured itself systematically, was not exactly or necessarily in their best interest. So, and or for the same one of the monarchies, we've seen to just keep on insisting, because this ideal, again, was already, as we've seen, a negotiation from the times in which literally you had to serve for life, as long as you had, for free, by the way, as long as you had the fief and all, right? Because that's literally what you were given. So this free service of only 40 days already per se represented an incredible limitation of what the same monarchs could feel on a regular basis. Of course, it's beyond the capacity of a feudal monarchy to control every single man, every single where in the country. But still, there were, in fact, more modern means to ensure that control that would revolve around, again, the formation of some de facto permanent armies in the 14th century, on the basis largely of the company's service, very often made up by the same guys, the same vassals, at least, let's say, members of the same aristocracy that would serve in exchange of money and for a lifetime, and really relieving the same vassals from this broader mechanism that, as we've seen, was also pretty imperfect per se. When we look at other Norman bailiwicks, right, aside from the Cotentin, we can see Caen, Caen, Rouen. We see that, for example, what the king could get in terms of manpower for free from these lands was substantially inferior. By the way, it's likely that Normandy, that I made a video on for the historical region series, by the way, or at least probably about the duchy, with its, as we've seen, very strong administrative traditions that dated back to the Plantagenets, responded to the royal appeal even better than other remote French provinces, because yes, the Normans had been, as we've seen, quite autonomous, also competitive, siding with the Angevins against the Capetians, but in this sense they were also between hammer and anvil, right, and were a fairly well developed say region, close both to London and Paris, so that they were in the eye of the storm as far as all these wars and the consequent organization of the land was concerned. Normandy would maintain important privileges, by the way, regarding her prerogatives, autonomies, even after they were taken by the Capetians. But if you talk about, for example, the newly conquered Occitanian lands in the south, those were, in times of crisis, somehow lost. You could have, yes, troops coming from there, but, say, the capacity of the Capetian monarchy from the north to exert control hundreds of kilometers south, several hundreds of kilometers south, just, with the same ease they would ask Normandy, for example, was just down the Seine Valley. a few hundreds of kilometers, was substantially lower, right? So and there is also to say, we've seen it especially in the video about Dauphiné, that yes, it's Burgundy, but I mean it's the Kingdom of Arles / Burgundy, but it's also reflecting a great part of the dynamics of the lands, especially of Occitania. Didn't have such a well systematized military system. That is to say, everything was ever more fragmented among smaller lords that always quarrel against one another, but didn't have that sense of collective organization that the North had always somehow maintained because of her imperial nature, right? If you look at even, you can trace back that feudal cradle from very early on, from the time that the Belgian latifundia were structured to support the Rhine legions from the Merovingian, the Carolingian times that had dominated all these other lands in the south. So those were more disorderly, more spent. That's also why Occitania was reconquered in a relatively easy way. At least there wasn't a major power there counterbalancing the north, right? There were also external interferences in it. So the sense is that of course, the Northerners knew how to make war better, and the local communities were somehow more prone just to participate. This, in fact, more rigid, stern disciplinarian mentality that was the one of the Capetian monarchy, that had also a dramatic capacity of projection. As far as, however, the bases of power were in the north, still in the north, right? So they could reconquer this entire system, but fundamentally they ruled from the north. In fact, the aforementioned third list, by the way, shows for the rest of Normandy, aside from the Cotentin, or actually, I think the entire Normandy included the Cotentin, only 672 knights, right? So if you take away the 55, right, you have there, well, it's still a substantial requirement, but if you say the Cotentin is just a small part of Normandy, right, and it's not developed particularly, right, there are these other, Rouen, Caen, those are the most important centers. Well, altogether you would expect more, right, and instead it's that contained, but this of course would go also as far as how much they had negotiated with Normandy that did maintain, even at that distance, that relatively short distance from Paris, such an important autonomy. There is, on that occasion, this list of Philip III's expedition, there is the contingent from Occitania, that however is not mentioned eventually among the troops that actually served. And this definitely doesn't depose too much in favor of, what we just said. Those lands would provide even less troops effectively, because they were also much more, they were in a sense more spent lands than the north. This is true, but in this sense they could not be relied on as far as, for example, a more collective organization was concerned. Consider that the numerous vassals pretended to serve at the king's expenses in general, and did not want to serve even outside the boundaries of their own province, right? So really a mentality, you gotta understand, because for centuries it had been like that. There hadn't been quite an overlord that would force you to fight. That these guys, as errant knights, as we've seen just yesterday, would go pretty much everywhere on their own, for whichever reason, but being forced to do just what somebody else asks you to do, and that you wouldn't do otherwise, and that requires this enormous expense, plus risking your life in the enterprise, is a wholly different matter. Some knights asserted to serve at sort of by free, only for goodwill, right? Without having any legal duty to do so, which was a way to say, remember that, again, I'm showing up, but I shouldn't, technically. So you should be only thankful as a ruler that I'm here. Plus, consider that the proportion of those who have themselves substituted seems to have touched like 2 out of 5. What does this mean? It means that all these various lords had, again, a military lifestyle, traditionally, because you couldn't be thought, even if you were a king, to be less of a knight, a warrior, fighter than others. But of course, again, they were going at war here, so if they thought it was not worth it, if they thought it was too risky or just it was a place they wouldn't want to die for, because maybe they were very courageous, but they had their own principles about that, these guys would have another soldier going to fight in their stead. It was very common, actually, and in parts did affect the quality of cavalry, because, say, of chivalry, and so this sense of feudal system, because, of course, the world was aging. These lords were, yes, warlike just by temperament, but they weren't, and they would remain for a very long time, but not necessarily would have just been up for every kind of military business when they had to maybe exercise the same within their own territory, settling some matters, acting politically, and not just, as we've seen, in a violent way per se. So this means that as far as politics was concerned, there was a gradual, at the beginning, perceptible shift towards the sort of gentrification of knighthood at this point. And also because really the king was starting to become that powerful that it seemed at some point at the beginning there was a real need of, let's say, let's defend ourselves against the Arabs or the Normans or the Magyars that arrived up to there even. And so at that point I have to move. It's my interest, whatever. But when you see that there is also such a powerful state above you, there is this sense of, but that will take care of the business wanted, right? And you see there also the burden of the monarchs increasing, because, again, you are the one who has built all of this, just like the knight a bit in his own lordship. Like, I'm the actual guy that holds everything, because I'm superior to everybody else. You wanted to arrive up there, you wanted to be recognized as king, you wanted to control the entire country, fine. Now it's up to you to make things work. And this is not so good, because of course, still it's about the moral support that you receive from the country as well. So overall, this is not to say that it was working particularly badly per se, but of course, there was the sense of fatigue, of entropy, of increasing costs of the system that would really catalyze other responses, crises, etc. On that occasion of 1272, the disappointment of Philip III was great. The royal administration attempted to somehow straighten up the situation by imposing to the contumaces, for example, heavy fines, which were a serious thing, especially if the king issued them on you, that were equal, by the way, to up the half of the compensation destined to the barons, to the bannerets, and to the knights, the squires, etc. Naturally, to the payment of the 40 days of service owed, right? So it was actually also, the highest defined, the least functional the effect actually is. So here it's a sort of, in fact, 50-50, in as much as, generally speaking, the system kept working, but you couldn't even over-punish these guys for not showing up, just per se. You didn't have the means, and generally speaking, this would say a military expedition was a very contingent thing in general, and you would just pursue these guys over time for not rendered that specific service. And God knows how you would pay for that in practice. They would politically, etc., because being also part of the royal clientele is very important. But it's also a matter of cost, as we've seen. So that 50% that you wouldn't spend on those 40 days, or even more if, let's say, you were brought to stay longer for some reason, in spite of all, because that could also happen. Telling the truth, it was also a matter of honor. What do you do? Do you leave now, etc.? Yes, they knew their rights, but there was also the sense of you've not been up like the others, stay, and those who in fact would gain more favor by the king. There was a spiritual tension about that, as we've seen. We know of a baron on that occasion that owed 40 days of free service and was condemned to pay 1,300 livres tournois, 100 solidi a day, more other 50 of fine, everything multiplied for 40. We're talking about 2 years later here, by the way, 1274, and you can immediately understand that wasn't much that the same French monarchy could do from all her might. Right? This gives you the scale of the entire feudal picture of those times, right, in Europe, but not only, by the way. And you can appreciate the increasing French reliance on mercenaries, as we were saying before. This is also true for all of Europe, but still here we're talking about French monarchic expeditions, wars on a regional scale that really were highlighting the dynamic macroscopically at the end of the century. If you look at the crusade in Aragon, 1285, which actually Philip III died, and his son had to pull out of, right, and dedicating himself to the opposite side of France. But did this mobilize almost exclusively mercenary elements, which was at least relatively normal, because this was, remember, an expedition outside of the frontiers of the kingdom, even though the old Spanish mark did fit in the Western Frankish kingdom. So parts, for example, of Catalonia were part of France, historical of the realm, at least. There was a site of operations more extended, and it was still felt like this is pretty far away, right? But if you look at the campaigns led by Philip IV against the Flemish, and I made a video just recently about the County of Flanders, and we explain also in another video the pretty nuanced relation between the King of France, the local count, and the communes, was again very complex, because this, as is notorious, Flanders was a bit of another country, but still within, historically, almost completely within probably the Western Frankish kingdom. You see that there is no real feudal traditional type of recruitment for these, right? The troops, we often say these were French vassals, etc., because they were, again, noblemen by birth. They had all these aristocrats, their retinues, their clienteles, but they were paid, right, in a very different way from the traditional levy, right? So the lists of the latter that have been preserved for the last years of the 13th and the first ones of the 14th century are very different from the ones of, for example, the aforementioned 1272. And this difference manifests the preponderance of a new type of a different type of recruitment, because around 1300, in the Kingdom of France, to put it bluntly, the servitium debitum, which means in Latin that service that you owe in that sense for free, that's the traditional one, was completely collapsing. Right? This is incredibly important after a massive military exploit. The Capetian monarchy cannot quite rely anymore, even though they control France entirely, the traditional system of levying troops just on, you're my vassal, you have to fight for this amount. Right? It had become, it's not just, it had become ineffective just as a, for the times being, right? Just the availability of troops in general and of money had changed dramatically, so that the same kings probably didn't see, aside from, as we've seen, the convenience of the idea of those guys essentially paying for themselves, in practical terms, to be a good idea, and to wage an actual war like the quite big ones in Aragon and Flanders. In the same way, the expedition of August 1294, on the occasion of the mobilization of men, only 166 knights and 17 squires recognized by themselves the duty of military service to the Duke of Brittany, fascinatingly enough. So this is a pretty transversal, this is happening pretty much everywhere across the realm, that again is quite big and somehow diverse, also ethnically. So there were some areas of Angevin tradition, others of Capetian one, whereas we've seen episcopal contingents, communes, etc. This entire thing doesn't quite, it's starting to depend ever more on the central force of the kingdom, its financial power, the capacity to attract mercenaries more directly through pay, right? And among the many factors that provoked this crisis, there is, of course, also the same geographical one, right? The fact that crossing France was a big deal for anyone, let's say even the troops that you could rise as mercenaries. Yes, they would flock to you if you had money, but they had to come from somewhere, right? And doesn't matter how big France, big and populous France was, the say also manpower was something that, as we've seen, costs to move, to equip, etc. And this especially problem of the distance seems to be recognized by the same monarchy to the vassals as a sort of appeasement, right, with them, and basically accepting loyalty in exchange for less service in some ways. In 1272, Toulouse, for example, pretended not to owe the service at their own expense, if not within the county, right? I made a video about the County of Toulouse, by the way. In 1315, the population of Champagne claimed the right to obey to the royal injunction only, quote, within the borders of Champagne. And this, by the way, were some of the most brutally and radically feudalized lands in the entire continent, right? The same Champagne inhabitants added that they would have fought even within the boundaries of their province for the king only for pay, right? And outside of it would have followed the sovereign only if reimbursed of, quote, all the expenses, of all the costs, right? So not something that it could simply, it was just the free part and then some extra. No, all of it. This is big, right? And from this you understand the force of the French monarchy in order to obtain that geographical boundaries would even disappear, because you have reconquered the entire France, right? And you tend to homogenize the entire system. That's why autonomies, for example, we've seen in the video about the Dutch of Burgundy, or same one in Normandy we mentioned before, were so important, because it was stressing a specificity of the land as opposed to a system that was trying to bring all the forces together, surpassing these divisions. Right? There is an important effort from the monarchy to properly provide the list of the dukes, counts, barons, and single knights that owed military service, to stress all together, right? Not on the basis of where they came from only, but as subjects to the French king. And statehood is forming, right? If you want to really look at when bureaucracy was established, it's not the 18th century, but exactly this French wealth papal system. On a broader level, we will see the army organization of the papacy, of other wealth powers, because it's quite advanced compared to the rest of Europe, but it still faces with the same exact issues that were even more rooted elsewhere. The same phenomenon, as we've seen, hit the territorial principalities. If in moments of crisis the Duke of Guyenne, for example, demanded sometimes to his Gascon subjects to follow him in arms across the territorial boundaries contemplated by their own privileges, and considered that Guyenne is not enormous, at least it develops very much into the Garonne basin inland, but say north-south, it's sort of easily crossable, and that's also where most of the issues would come from, by the way, strategically. There is the campaign of Poitou, for example, 1242-43, and there is a letter that accompanies one of his invitations, let's say, of these troops, in which he would, in fact, recognize, of course, the validity of those privileges, because, again, this is how medieval law worked, really. It was about customs had been established, and if you didn't have the force as a public authority to dismiss, right, to surpass, you couldn't quite legislate against this, also because you would lose the control really on the situation, would create many more problems than not. And as we were just saying, normally the inhabitants of Poitou had to make their service south of the Loire. The Gascons, essentially in this broader area between the Pyrenees and the Garonne river, they literally called it Inter Portus et Garonnem, right? The inhabitants of Bordeaux within the boundaries of the diocese of Bordeaux, the ones of Agenais within the boundaries of the diocese of Agen, etc. Right? So, and all this is fairly small in scale compared to what, say, factually major expeditions would have, say, for the normal political and strategic needs of the times, of course, would contemplate on a regular basis, right? So this is, as we just said, what this practically meant is not that the knights from these lands wouldn't actually go fighting somewhere else, but that they wouldn't do it at the local ruler's request, right? They would prefer, say, to serve the same guys as mercenaries than as feudal levies, and that's obvious. We've seen how much they had to pay just to do this for free, and so there was not much that could be done in the first place to convince them otherwise, because it was too much of an expense. This, however, also does go in parallel with, meaningfully enough, with the decline of the same fiefs. We have seen it in the videos about the historical regions series, as far as the fact that by the 13th century, basically, the Capetians take over everything. So even if there are all these lords, these privileges, etc., in practice, these are privileges to remain just untouched within their own local stuff, while the monarchy has literally taken off and has taken out these guys as well in terms of political autonomy, right? And that also explains why this reaction, right? If these guys had wanted to keep on fighting their own wars as they used to do in the past, of course they were smaller as powers than now what the French monarchy had been establishing, so they were just limited by that in general. But it was also a way of saying, if we have to do some sort of policing, if there is an invasion, whatever, here, we will move, we will just serve, because it's self-evident. But fighting elsewhere, no. You wanted the dominion in this area, you essentially exhausted our own resources in the process, because you have began to augment dramatically your own power. And there is also a general Capetian effort to use ever more bourgeois in the administration to centralize further, to get more money, that, as we've seen, were the ones that were necessary to levy the professionals, and everything was easier than waiting for all these various contingents to serve for free, coming from everywhere, and just to bring them all together. It was just impractical, right? So at this point, when there is finally an availability to do things on a bigger scale, they do, right? If you compare this with, consider also that the broader scale in Europe, think about the Carolingian Empire, much more archaic system, but at least it went on conquering and looting and seizing the lands of other peoples, right? France was doing this actually in a way, but in a much more framed context, which there were lots of other kingdoms, states, cities, etc., for which you couldn't quite simply go out there and spend so many resources for terrifying wars. And actually, in fact, the ones in Aragon and in Flanders were overall failures, right? Even though, especially in Flanders, there the local Flemish power was practically crushed, and so it was a no-win for many. But that's where, in fact, the crisis of the late 13th and the 14th century starts kicking in for everyone. So that when you evaluate the failures of such a big system like the one of the French monarchy, you can say that it's spectacular, because this country was that big and that ambitious and developed, and so when it failed, it made a bigger crash, right? But this is not to say that the rest of Europe actually was going was faring particularly better as far as these levels of civilizational development, and so they didn't have the force themselves. I mean, the empire basically during the 13th century eclipses itself. Even as we've seen in 100 Years' War, the same England basically loses it at the end of the day in spite of all its victories. It was just, if they had lost even one of those major battles, they would have crashed themselves, and they remained cut off from the continent afterwards. You have there's lots of stuff going on. You have, I don't know, even the rise of Catalonia in the 13th century, yes, and then what after, like it's there are dynastic possessions. There is an ever greater game of elites, but as far as this big push and spring and exploit, like after the 13th century, Eurasia is exhausted, or starts exhausting itself, and then there is this lower phase where other systems are developed according to the situation that we've seen elsewhere, and or we'll keep talking about, of course, on a regular basis, right? But this is a bit the picture, right? And again, there is really a lot of examples that we can bring. Maybe another video will be on England, because it's basically the same dynamic during the 13th century. It's fascinating because it shows, again, this is the same for Sicily. This is, you find it really pretty much everywhere, and for the same exact dynamics. right? In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.